Forget everything you thought you knew about ancient Japan. There's a period in its history so dark, so unsettling, that even today, historians whisper about it with unease. An age when the divine emperors vanished, when the gods themselves seemed to abandon the islands, when the unbroken Imperial line, the very foundation of an entire civilization, simply disappeared into shadow. This wasn't just political chaos. This was the shattering of a sacred truth, a fracture so deep that Japan would never be the same again. What happened during those lost centuries? And why does almost no one talk about it? Picture ancient Japan in its golden age. The Yamato dynasty ruling from magnificent palaces. Emperors descended from Amaterasu herself, the sun goddess. Every emperor a living god. Every ritual a connection between heaven and earth. The imperial court glittered with silk and ceremony. The land was unified under one divine authority. One bloodline, unbroken since the age of myth. This was the promise that Japan would never fall, that the gods would never abandon their children, that the emperor would reign forever. But even the sun casts shadows. By the late 8th century, cracks were forming. Plagues swept through the capital. Famines darkened the countryside. The imperial treasury was bleeding gold. Buddhist temples grew too powerful, and noble clans schemed in the shadows. And far across the sea, something was stirring. The great Tang dynasty of China, Japan's model and inspiration, was collapsing. If even the mighty Tang could fall, what did that mean for Japan? The emperors of Japan weren't like other kings. They didn't rule by conquest. They ruled by blood. Sacred blood. The blood of the sun goddess herself, flowing through their veins. This wasn't propaganda. This was an absolute, unshakable belief that held an entire nation together. Every peasant, every warrior, every monk knew this truth. The emperor was a god walking among mortals. To question him was to question the cosmos itself. But what happens when a god disappears? By the 9th century, something unprecedented was happening. Emperors were ascending to the throne younger and younger. Some were mere children, puppets controlled by powerful regent families like the Fujiwara clan. The divine authority was becoming hollow, a mask worn by others. And then came the silence. Records from the imperial court, once detailed and meticulous, began to thin. Then gaps appeared, years without documentation, decades where historians can only guess what happened. Entire generations lost to the fog of history. The center was fading, and no one could stop it. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It was slow, erosive, like a temple sinking into the earth. First came the natural disasters. Mount Fuji erupted in 864 AD, spewing ash across the heartland. The Jagan earthquake and tsunami in 869 devastated the northern coast. Tens of thousands died, entire villages swallowed by the sea. The people looked to their divine emperor for answers, for protection, for miracles. But the emperor was silent, hidden behind layers of courtiers and regents, a phantom in his own palace. Then came the internal bleeding. The Fujiwara clan had perfected a poisonous art, marrying their daughters to emperors, then controlling the crown through the children. The emperor became a prisoner of ceremony, a sacred object, revered but powerless. And then the fracture. By the 10th century, imperial authority outside the capital had simply evaporated. Provincial governors stopped sending taxes to Kyoto. They built their own armies and claimed their own lands. Warriors in the countryside, the samurai, began serving local lords, not a distant emperor. The archipelago was fragmenting. Japan was becoming many Japans. But here's what makes this era truly dark. The imperial records, the official histories, simply stopped being written. The last official chronicle ended in 887 AD. After that, silence. For centuries, there would be no official imperial history, no divine record, no proof that the gods were still watching. It was as if heaven itself had turned away. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that God has stopped speaking. That's what this felt like for ancient Japan. The emperor, the living link between heaven and earth, had become invisible. Not dead, not overthrown, just absent. Present, but powerless. Divine, but silent. There is a haunting detail from this period that historians have struggled to explain. Multiple emperors during the 10th and 11th centuries abdicated. They simply gave up the throne, not out of shame or defeat, but because the role itself had become unbearable. What does it mean to be a living god when you have no power, when your word moves nothing, when your people suffer and you cannot help them? Some emperors escaped into monasteries, shaved their heads, and became monks, seeking spiritual answers because earthly ones had failed. The throne remained, but the divine fire had gone out. And across Japan, in villages and towns far from the capital, people began to forget. Forget the emperor's face, forget the sound of his edicts, forget even that he was supposed to matter. The center had vanished, and Japan was learning to live without it. But life doesn't stop when empires crumble. It adapts. In the provinces, far from the ghost court of Kyoto, a new Japan was being born. This was the rise of the warrior. Without imperial armies to protect them, landowners hired samurai, skilled fighters from provincial families. These warriors weren't noble. They were pragmatic, brutal, and loyal to whoever paid them. Loyalty to the emperor, that was a story for priests and poets. This was also the rise of the warlord. Powerful families like the Taira and the Minamoto began carving out their own domains. They ruled through strength, not divine right, through fear and respect earned with blood. They were the new reality. For ordinary people, this era was chaos. Without central authority, bandits roamed freely and pirates terrorized the coasts. Villages fortified themselves, trusting no one beyond their own walls. But something unexpected was happening. In the absence of imperial culture, local cultures flourished. Regional art forms emerged. New Buddhist sects spread, promising salvation in a broken world. The tale of Genji was written during this period, a masterpiece of literature born in an age of imperial decline. People were creating meaning in the void. New gods, new stories, new ways of being Japanese that didn't require an emperor at all. Japan was fragmenting, but it was also diversifying, experimenting, becoming something it had never been before. But the myth refused to die. Even as real power slipped away from Kyoto, the idea of the emperor endured. Children still heard stories of the Divine Bloodline. Monks still prayed for the imperial family. Warriors still invoked the emperor's name, even as they ignored his commands. Why? Because myths are useful. When the Minamoto clan finally seized military control of Japan in 1185, they could have abolished the emperor entirely. They had the power, they had the armies, but they didn't. Instead, they created a new system. The emperor would remain divine, sacred, untouchable, but he would have no power. The shogun, the military dictator, would rule in his name. This was genius. By keeping the emperor, they kept the myth. And by keeping the myth, they kept Japan unified under a shared story. The emperor became a symbol, a legitimizer, a sacred stamp of approval for whoever truly held power. The Dark Age had taught Japan a terrible lesson. Divine right means nothing without earthly power. But earthly power means nothing without divine legitimacy. So Japan would have both, separated and balanced. Emperor and shogun, heaven and sword. This system would last for 700 years. So what was Japan's Dark Age? It wasn't the absence of emperors. They were always there, sitting in their palaces, performing their rituals. It was the death of the illusion, the shattering realization that divine blood doesn't stop earthquakes, that sacred lineage doesn't feed the hungry, that myth alone cannot hold a nation together. But here's the paradox. This period of weakness forged Japan's greatest strength. The samurai culture, with its discipline, loyalty, and martial skill, was born in this chaos. The idea of rule by merit, not just birth, took root. Regional diversity created artistic richness, and the separation of symbolic power from real power created a unique political flexibility. For the next 1,000 years, Japan would survive crisis after crisis, Mongol invasions, civil wars, foreign colonization threats, world wars, all because it learned in its Dark Age how to bend without breaking. The emperor could lose all power and still matter. The government could change completely and still claim continuity. Japan could transform and still be Japan. This is the forgotten gift of the Dark Age. Not collapse, but evolution. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Today, the Japanese emperor still sits on the chrysanthemum throne, still descended from that ancient line, still performing rituals older than most civilizations. But he does not rule. He doesn't need to. Because Japan learned long ago that myths are most powerful when they're not tested, that gods endure longest when they remain in heaven. The Dark Age taught Japan how to worship the past while living fully in the present. And that lesson echoes still. If you love cinematic history stories like this, hit like, share this with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more legendary tales from the forgotten corners of time. Because every Dark Age has secrets, and some of them change everything. Thanks for watching.